I feel very honoured because the exhibition that you see here, this is its actual first showing in public in the United Kingdom. It was conceived along with the late Professor Richard Holmes, who I'm sure many of you will know, and we wanted to produce something for the First World War, which we felt, because it had involved everybody in the country, we wanted to create an exhibition which would reach out to everybody. The exhibition that you see here is intended for schools, because this was very much part of our desire, was to reach out to the younger generation. The main exhibition will be shown as a street gallery. It is opening in Paris in Les Jardins du Luxembourg. The French government have declared it as an official project, and it is opening there on April the 8th. We'll be there for 4 months. It's coming to this country in August. It will be in St. James's by the Guards Memorial. We've been granted St. James's Park, which I think is, feel very honoured by that. The purpose of this exhibition, I'll be quite honest, ladies and gentlemen, it is not for you. You are interested in the First World War. We want to reach out to people who know nothing about it, have no interest, and may not even have heard about it, which is why we're doing it as a street gallery. Because there are a large number of people who would never go to a museum, never go to an art gallery. But what we want to do is to have it on the street, where people will come across it as they're going around their daily lives. So that is the purpose of the reason why it will be outdoors. It will consist of 60 pictures. It is not to explain the history of the First World War. It is to interest people in the subject, to draw them in, and then they can go and do their own research. We've got the support of the Imperial War Museum and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So that is the general idea behind it. The actual pictures themselves, the First World War is no longer a war of memory. It's a war of history. And these photographs, Richard and I wanted to look at the battlefields in a different way. We decided that, you know, after 100 years, these places of horror and killing have now become places of beauty and tranquility. So if you like, time and nature have healed the wounds of war. There are some of them are still obvious, but that is the theme behind the exhibition. I do hope you'll see it. As I said, it opens on August the 4th in St. James's Park. So I do hope you'll see it, and do, if you have a position of responsibility, do encourage your local towns to have it, because we do want this to tour. We've already got cities around the country where we're going to be going to, but as I said, it is really to reach out to people who would know nothing else about the First World War.
My academic interest really spans both the First World War and contemporary civil-military relations, and that's really what this article is about. It's almost looking at contemporary civil-military relations and looking at their implications for the First World War. Now, the image of the soldier victim of the First World War has become, I think, entrenched in the British popular imagination during the last 30 years. It's not a view that's necessarily reflected in the academic literature, and it wasn't necessarily the dominant view that was seen at the time during the First World War. But I think it's become more and more entrenched over the last 30 years. Now, there's a debate over the timing of when this reductive script came in, of looking at the war from of the view of it being pointless and from the view of it being mismanaged. I'm not really going to rehearse some of those arguments. What I want to look at today, really, is the three key trends that I think are reinforcing this reductive script about the pointlessness of war, the mismanagement of war, and ultimately the portrayal of the soldier as victim. Now, these three key themes that I want to look at are family history and the impact that is having on the way in which we perceive the soldier, increasing public interest in psychological reactions to war, and current British attitudes to the use of force. So I'll just now go and have a little look at each of those three key trends. Family history first, then. I think the family history is really important. I think we can all agree that it's been rising in popularity over the last 20 years. And it's often the point at which people who don't know very much about the First World War become interested and get interested. But the way in which family history is set up, the way in which people do family history, actually helps to reinforce this soldier-victim image. Because I'd argue that family history is very individualized. You approach it through an individual. And it often encourages an empathetic approach. You imagine what it felt like to be your ancestor. And imagining how soldiers felt and thought is difficult enough if you've got a wide knowledge of social, political, and cultural trends, and you've also got diaries and memoirs there to interpret. But often family historians don't have that kind of information. They've got very little information. And so they often fill in the gaps, if you like, with this empathy that I think helps to reinforce this soldier-victim image. There's also the point that British society in general has become more accepting of the idea of victimhood. To be a victim isn't necessarily now a particularly negative thing. And I've argued that actually this growth of this idea in society can help to provide a point of connection that relatives seek with those in the past. If they're if they feel that their relative, their soldier relative was a victim, they've got that point of connection. That's the family history argument. The second trend that I want to look at are the increasing public expectations that all soldiers are going to suffer from psychological damage as a result of participating in war. Now, it's the First World War that first linked psychiatric injury with wartime experience. The term shell shock enters the British lexicon in 1915, and although it's quickly rejected as a diagnosis, actually the British public take it up, and it helps to partially legitimise psychological illness as a result of war. It doesn't remove stigma, but it helps to reduce stigma attached to a psychological diagnosis. The victim image, though, of the shell-shock soldier is only one of a variety of conceptions of the soldier after the war. And while psychologically damaged veterans weren't always branded cowards, they weren't necessarily lauded as heroes either. So we get a whole diversity of views of what the soldier was about up until the 1980s. And in the 1980s, we can trace a much greater public sympathy for traumatized veterans, due in part to the US experience of Vietnam, and a change in British cultural attitudes to those which promoted self-expression rather than perhaps self-restraint. And I think this has been taken even further in the last decade, where there's now an increasing public expectation that whatever the reality, soldiers will be damaged by their experience of war. And this has helped to reinforce the victim image, the soldier victim image of the First World War. And a good example of how this has played out is the Shot at Dawn campaign. Now, the Shot at Dawn group successfully campaigned throughout the 1990s to rehabilitate those British soldiers who were executed for military crimes during the First World War. And it was the government that eventually agreed to a conditional pardon by 2006. The arguments put forward by the groups stressed the youth of those who'd been executed, but also their psychological vulnerability, and that was a key plank of their arguments. They argued that they had become victims of a very arbitrary discipline system which automatically dismissed psychological injury as a defense. Now, the campaign fitted very neatly with this victimized soldier image and the reductive narrative of this pointless, brutal war, but it failed to really engage with the fact that, yes, the psychiatric profession was in its infancy in the early 20th century, and yes, sometimes court-martial officials weren't very familiar with psychological problems as a result of war, and there were undoubtedly miscarriages of justice. But even by the rules of the time, the vast majority of the estimated 200,000 British psychological casualties didn't find themselves in front of a firing squad. So I think it's almost been taken out of proportion, this idea of psychological casualties automatically being executed. The language of victimhood is also important in this debate. It was used by many groups and many different individuals that were involved in discussing it. And some campaigners suggested that those executed were just as much victims as those killed by the enemy, and they sought to establish a parity of victimhood. And in doing that, in seeking to align the experience and image of those executed with the ordinary soldier, they revealed the extent to which that victim image had already become accepted by the 1990s. And finally, the third contemporary trend that I want to have a look at is contemporary attitudes to war. British attitudes to the use of force today have an impact on how we view the soldier from the First World War. the increasing public unease with the use of force and the experience of recent conflicts has led, I've argued in other places, to the contemporary British soldier being cast as a victim, sometimes of government incompetence, sometimes of flawed strategy, and often these come out in popular narratives. What I want to argue here is that the linkages that have been made between the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and the First World War have proved mutually reinforcing for that victim image. The linkages have been made in lots of different areas. In the article, I go into this in a lot more detail, but I just want to take one instance of commemoration to illustrate this. The death of the last veterans of the First World War in 2009 provided some of the best opportunities to make explicit links. The remembrance service held in Westminster Abbey after the death of Harry Patch involved the symbolic linking of Iraq and Afghanistan and the First World War with two contemporary Victoria Cross winners laying a wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier. Talking to the press at the service, the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown linked the bravery and sacrifice of that First World War generation with men and women serving with distinction today. He was referring to those serving in Afghanistan at the time. But government attempts to legitimize the war in Afghanistan during what was a particularly contentious period of the conflict were countered by the national press and blogs making much more negative comparisons, highlighting futility, tragedy, and unnecessary casualties of both conflicts. The First World War came to be a useful example to illustrate arguments about the validity and nature of contemporary conflict. So despite the very different political contexts in which contemporary conflicts in the First World War were fought, there were really striking similarities in the public interpretation of their meaning and context today. And so in varying ways, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the First World War have all been assessed as futile, mismanaged, and it follows, therefore, that the soldiers that fought in them were victims of both the meaning and the conduct of those wars. So quickly, with 1 minute to go, where does this leave us today? Well, I think the centenary of the conflict provides an opportunity to build a more complex and nuanced view of the soldier's experience. There's a significant public desire to understand the First World War, and historians have proved actually very interested in trying to engage with the public through a range of different media and a range of different organizations. But historians and their research have only a very small part to play in the process of constructing the public scripts about the First World War. And I think those trends that have identified family history, psychological damage, and attitudes towards force are going to make it quite difficult for historians and other organizations to make any change to diversify that dominant victimized soldier motif.
I came to this project really by, and the material in the article, by pulling on a red thread in the sense that, as Patricia's said in her introduction, my research so far has focused on problems to do with the coordination and cooperation in the Great Depression, in the Second World War, and inside the League of Nations in the 1920s and 1930s. But there was this constant reference back to what had happened in Austria in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. So that's what led me to this. And what I've tried to do in the article, first and foremost, is really two things. One is to underline that though the League of Nations presented itself as an organization made new and dedicated to international peace, and that peace was the opposite of war in 1919 when the organization was set up, in fact, there's a continuity from the war into the peace. And actually, if you read Hugh Strawn's very rich and illuminating review of recent books on the First World War in this issue too, he makes exactly the same point. So there's civil war, there's revolution, there's episodes of ethnic cleansing in the immediate aftermath of the First World War that kill around 4 to 5 million people between 1918 and 1923. So though I talk about the beginnings of international order and international peace in 1918, in fact, there's not very much peace to be had. The second thing I try to do in the article is to show the ways in which the League of Nations reflected the wider sense of security that we have today. In the last 20 years or so, we've begun to think about international security in in broad terms that the UN calls human security. So we're more aware of the ways in which war triggers migration movements, war brings about epidemic and famine. Whereas in the past, security before that certainly was set in the ways that people thought about it in the Cold War, and it was dominated much more by a sense of hard security, so weapons, disarmament. And that also reflected the way that people historically have researched into the League of Nations. All of these problems, the relationship between international security and this wider concern of financial crisis and famine, was found in Austria in 1918. Austria was the state, which has in some ways surprised me, that the British, the French, and the Americans focused on particularly at the end of the war. And it was really because the Austro-Hungarian Empire had collapsed in on itself, and Austria was not only being embargoed at the start by the Allies, but also by its previous states. So Austria is now a very small country of around 4 million people, and it's experiencing intense famine and also hyperinflation. And in the article, I tried to trace the ways in which the League of Nations became involved in trying to save Austria and to reconstruct both its financial system and its economy, and also to provide food relief to the 4 million Austrians who find themselves starving. And it's an especial problem for Vienna. And in some ways, Austria, I kept asking myself this question of why this preoccupation with Austria. And what's clear is that Western concern is not really centered on the threat of communism in the way that it is in food aid to Russia, or the threat to health in the way that also there are responses in Greece and in Bulgaria, which are related to the flu epidemic and also refugee movement. Instead, in the case of Austria, reflecting recent preoccupations in global history, there's a sense that Austrians are in some ways superior and worthy of Western aid. And that comes around really in a variety of different ways. The first is the way that the British and the French attempt to cast the Austrians not as Germans, but as French. So to give you a citation, something I say in the article, to quote the British Foreign Office, the Austrian people, if there's anyone in the Austrian here in the audience who are Austrian, you'll be pleased to hear, you are sober, hardworking, enterprising, in some details gay, cultured, chivalrous, and when true to yourselves, a thoroughly lovable race. You're a people not unlike the French, and really quite entirely foreign to what is now known as the true German character. So part of this project is about showing Austrians not as Germans, when of course everybody knows they're certainly German speaking. And the other strand that's there that's very powerful, and it influences Eglantine Jebb, for example, who sets up Save the Children, whose first major mission is inside Vienna and then inside Austria before they move elsewhere, is it also sees Austria, and particularly Vienna, as the treasury of high culture. And it's also that Viennese children, in particular, are the focus of international scientific interest. That's partly, of course, to do with Freud and the advent of modern psychology, but it's also around a progressive art movement pioneered by an Austrian, well, kind of ends up Austrian, everybody's rebranded several times through this process, called Franz Zizek. And Zizek is famous for pioneering child art, so developing the sense that children express their emotions and their sense of self through their own artistic endeavors. And his work's already very prominent before the First World War, but immediately afterwards, the International Red Cross puts together an exhibition of Zizek's children's artwork, and in fact this then tours 40 cities across Britain and Northern Ireland into Ireland and then around the world, and the Red Cross, International Red Cross, put these images on their Christmas cards and so on. So it's really about science on the one hand, and Austrian culture, but there's also a sense of racial ordering in this, and I've suggested already why, the way the Austrians are French and not really Germans, and they're certainly not Eastern barbarians. So in the article I talk about the way in which the activists, humanitarian activists, compare their experience in Austria to their experience in Moscow, which is altogether much more difficult and dirty and unpleasant. And then the final part of the article talks about how this is also activated in the way that the League of Nations takes over the financial rescue of Austria, which is the first international practice of financial oversight that's established anywhere. So the way that the IMF and now the European Central Bank manages financial crises comes out of this experience in Austria, and the management of famine and food at the time was related. And the final kind of conclusion of the article explores the way that this is driven very strongly by priorities set by the American state. So American agencies are a very important part of this, though the Americans never joined the League of Nations. And also the way that the Austrians come to experience and reflect on this, that they feel, on the one hand, the League of Nations offered them the promise of international citizenship, but they were instead the objects of international charity.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite you to consider the proposition that this war and all wars are profoundly shaped in our conception of them by works of art of all kinds and conditions. So I suppose in our culture, I mean, roughly speaking, English-speaking peoples, we've only to consider war poetry, which has been virtually synonymous with great war poetry for several decades now, to begin to take the measure of just how important to our conception of the Great War art, in that instance poetry, can be. The poetry has, I think, given us one of the leitmotifs of this war, one of the scripts, if you will, and a lightning conductor for feeling about it. I mean what we might encapsulate as the pity of war. But I don't want to talk more about poetry just at the moment, though I dare say we might before the evening is out. What I would really like to do is tell you a little story about the painting that Patricia mentioned. A small painting that packs a terrific punch. This painting. This is Angelus Novus, the New Angel, by Paul Klee. This angel appeared, as I guess it would be appropriate to say, immediately after the Great War, 1920. And it, what shall I say, takes off in history owing to its first owner, who is Walter Benjamin. Those of you who are German-speaking will forgive my mangling of the name, but it's how we know him, I think. Walter Benjamin, an all-purpose intellectual, one of the greatest intellectuals of the last century, a man who wrote on practically everything and puts the rest of us who try to be intellectuals to shame. Benjamin owned this painting, and it was indeed his most treasured possession. And something he wrote about it in 1940, another pregnant year, puts it on the historical map. Benjamin wrote this little text in one of his most renowned pieces of writing on the concept of history. He wrote, "There is a picture by Klee called Angelus Novus. It shows an angel who seems about to move away from something he stares at. His eyes are wide, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how the angel of history must look. His face is turned towards the past. Where a chain of events appears before us, he sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise, and has got caught in his wings. It is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. This storm drives him irresistibly into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows towards the sky. What we call progress is this storm. This has become one of the most celebrated passages in Benjamin's celebrated oeuvre. And it gives to us the name, the title, the formulation, the angel of history. This is the angel of history. It's a passage that is difficult to interpret, or put another way, it is wide open to interpretation and has been interpreted and reinterpreted ever since. And that indeed is part of the power of art, I suggest to you. It catches the imagination. Benjamin loved this painting. He loved the angel. He saw in it something of himself and something of his time. For him, this was a witness to history. The angel witnesses the great catastrophe, perhaps the founding catastrophe of this terrible century, the Great War. I like to think of where a chain of events appears before us as all those arguments about the causation of the First World War. He sees one single catastrophe. He is perhaps Neil Ferguson, come among us. I hope he's not in the audience, but no doubt we'll be hearing from him. So this text, this argument between Benjamin and Clay, between Benjamin and his angel, is what sparks this argument with history, about what kind of history we confront, about our predicament. The artist then as witness to our time. The artist as moral witness, as a philosopher has said, is a very resonant theme, and surely applicable to war in general and the Great War in particular. The provenance of this painting, who owned it, where it went, is also of tremendous historical interest. It was owned by Walter Benjamin, one of the great intellectuals of the era. It was owned by his friend Theodor Adorno, one of the other great intellectuals of the era. And it was owned by Gershom Scholem, their friend, a third great intellectual. It passes through the hands of all three men, close friends, separated by wars and rumors of wars. It migrates, this angel migrates from Germany to France, to exile in the United States, till it comes back to Europe and eventually finds its promised land. It is now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So the passage of the angel through the 20th century, the provenance, is also a kind of parable of the century, a parable of history. And I think that the provenance of works of art, tracking them, is something that we have yet to do much research on in international politics and can reveal tremendous things to us. Benjamin then was in dialogue with Clay, the artist, about the meaning of the painting. He was also in dialogue with his two friends, Adorno and Scholem, about the meaning of the painting. And the various meanings or identifications that have been suggested are another layer of fascination in the story. Adorno had his own idea about who this angel represented, who it could be identified with. Adorno wrote this: "During the First World War, or shortly after, Clay drew cartoons of Kaiser Wilhelm as an inhuman iron eater. Later, in 1920, these became the Angelus Novus, the machine angel, who, though he no longer bears any emblem of caricature or commitment, flies far beyond both. The machine angel's enigmatic eyes force the onlooker to try to decide whether he is announcing the culmination of disaster or salvation hidden within it. But as Walter Benjamin, who owned the drawing, said, he is the angel who does not give, but takes. So here is a suggestion from Adorno that the angel is really Kaiser Wilhelm in disguise. Or Kaiser Wilhelm, what shall we say, transmogrified. And Adorno was quite right that Klee did caricatures of the Kaiser. Whether he was quite right that this is the Kaiser with wings, I'm not so sure. But here's one suggestion to you. And Adorno also points up the question, does the angel come to us with the possibility of hope, salvation, redemption? This is, after all, what angels are often supposed to do. Or is the angel announcing something bleaker, darker, forever driven back, the debris piling up? The debris continues to pile up, ladies and gentlemen. The idea that the angel is the Kaiser does not exhaust the interpretive possibilities of this image. Most recently, it has been suggested that the new angel is none other than Adolf Hitler. This sounds far-fetched, but there is in Klee's work of this period Hitler-like images. And who knows if he could be the Kaiser transmogrified, perhaps also Hitler lurks here too. My point is that the image itself is so fertile that it has linked one war with another. It takes us through history. It does something else. It acts as inspiration for more artworks. So, in another pregnant year, 1989, the prodigious German artist Anselm Kiefer produced an angel in 3D, this installation. This is Kiefer's Angel of History, Poppy and Memory, a bomber with a book or books on its wings and poppies also. It is laden with poppies and memories. Poppy and memory harks back to the German poet Paul Celan, harks back to the Holocaust. The angel then transports us from one war to another, through the century, through interpretations of history. This is what art can do for us. Art can somehow give us hope. It can inspire thought. It can come laden with a kind of ethical freight. Here you see ethical freight made real. It can, in the end, inspire.